Welcome back to the show, everyone. Ian Walker, before he left, said, what's with all the smart people on the show today? I thought he was talking about me. No, he's talking about our next guest.
That's right. You've met Dr. Dan Kalla on our show before. Of course, he's got his book of Flesh and Blood, which is now out in paperback. And I am holding a galley copy of his brand new book, due out in the fall, The Far Side of the Sky. How are you, Dr. Dan?
Hi, Dan. How are you?
Great to be back.
Now, we're going to talk about a couple things, but one of them has a nice tie-in to one of the storylines of Flesh and Blood. Tell us about the book first, for people that may not be familiar now that it's out in paperback as well.
Yeah, it's a big, it's sort of a family saga told over 100 years, but it's set in like a fictional Mayo Clinic. You know, and my family was this multi-generational medical family, so I kind of tied into that and tell the story of the founding of this Mayo Clinic-like hospital and the trials and tribulations it went through at the founding, and 100 years later why it's facing a crisis. And, you know, and tried to tie some pertinent medical storylines that affect us today.
Well, and one of those pertinent medical storylines was one of the characters was deeply involved in research, funding-based, and would have gotten a huge grant for the hospital. And some of the research came under suspicion, and that's sort of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a big deal now. I mean, it's, you know, people don't realize it, but research is a little like rock and roll, right? You hit that one big song that gets picked up and you can become famous overnight, and there's so much pressure to hit that perfect study and that home run out of the ballpark.
What's the term, publish or perish?
Yeah, that's exactly, that's the term they use, publish or perish, because these big labs are funded by lots of, sometimes it's drug company, but often it's these health agencies that fund the studies, and if they don't produce, if they don't get that big Lancet,
they don't get the money.
Funding's gone.
A while back, I read an article about a fraudulent study regarding child immunizations, and maybe you can explain a little bit more about that, because it was kind of shocking to hear that it wasn't true.
Yeah. In 1998, Lancet, which is a huge British journal, published a study about this that changed the way a lot of parents, hundreds of thousands of parents, addressed childhood immunization, the standard MMR, the measles study, and they linked this vaccine to the chance of developing autism. And it changed, you know, and a lot of people were suspicious, a lot of parents were suspicious of vaccines anyway, but unfortunately it had this massive effect on the way parents approached immunizing their children. And just to follow up with Fiona's point, finally, 10 years later, after many people proved that this study was not only wrong, it was fraudulent, Lancet finally retracted it a couple of years back, but a lot of people think the damage was already done.
How does that happen, that something gets published that is so far from what is the truth and what is known?
Well, I mean, you know, you can hide things very well, and everything's peer-reviewed. In other words, other academics look at this and decide that the study is accurate and stuff, but there's all kinds of ways of hiding the truth and you know, there's all kinds of different kind of fraud, and that's what I touched on in this book of Flesh and Blood. Sometimes it's who you include in the study, and sometimes it's who you don't include in the study.
Yeah, well, and it's also, you know, there's a big team working on a lot of this research as well, and yes, there's the head of the research, but you can't always be on top of every little bit of research that's coming in, so there's a lot of gaps in the system.
Yeah, there is, and you know, and it is vetted very well, and there's supposed to be lots of protection in the system, but mistakes. This is probably, this 1998 study is probably the best example of a exposed fraud, but it changes practices, and it affects people way beyond.
And that's the hard part, because I remember being a father right around when this came out, and it really gives you pause, because when your kids do get immunized, they don't feel very good for a couple of days, and people left to chalk up. But I remember thinking, like, you know, is there this connection? So I guess that's the real concern when a fraudulent study like this goes out too, isn't it? Is that the lasting repercussions of that misinformation, especially in the age of Facebook, Twitter, and
absolutely, yeah, you're right. This goes exactly, but this goes viral as we like overnight, and you know, and then you're this parent, and you're a first-time parent, you don't want to harm, you know, with that feeling of wanting to protect all, and so somebody tells you that, but what you don't understand are the underlying repercussions of not immunizing your kid, and you know, and all the effect you have, and also we were talking about this earlier too, the societal obligations you have to prevent, you know, if you're not immunizing your kid against measles, you're not only potentially exposing your kids, you're potentially exposing his entire class at school. So there's all kinds of trickle-down effect from it.
Okay, we have to talk about the new book, because we were excited to see. This is not out yet, people. Tell us a little bit. I've only read the back, The Far Side of the Sky. What is it all about?
Well, this is kind of my passion project that I've wanted to do for the last 5 years. I'm really excited. HarperCollins is publishing this in the fall, and it's the story of Shanghai in World War II, which was this amazing story, and it's largely the story of how they protected 20,000 German Jews that that were being, in the late 30s, right before the Holocaust, Jews were allowed to leave Germany if they had somewhere to go. I mean, they were being persecuted, but all the countries had fulfilled their quotas, and there was many of them had nowhere to go. But without visas, they could get, if they could afford to and had the connections to, they could get steamliner tickets and end up in this city, Shanghai, that was this open port city, and it was an amazing city at the time. And so they arrived from, you know, they left this high-functioning German society and landed in this Las Vegas of the East. It was this amazing city with more brothels, more opium, more wealth, more poverty than anywhere. And people don't realize the story. And it was half invaded by the Japanese already by that time. The Japanese had taken over part of the area, partly controlled by the British.
Really?
And it had this incredible path during the war that I don't think people, I certainly had no idea.
Well, and you would have ended up with an amazing collection of, you know, scholars, intellects.
Oh, and misfits, gangsters.
Yeah,
they were all
exactly.
there in the city. The communists, I mean, Chinese communist movement started in Shanghai in the 20s. You know, everything, these, like everybody, every character, nefarious and great, and seemed to pass through Shanghai in the 30s and 40s.
How much research did you do for this?
A ton, yeah. This one I couldn't just fake. I couldn't just get on Wikipedia. I had to actually, I couldn't phone this in.
You did all your stuff, Dan.
Well, usually, but we actually went to Shanghai and spent time there and toured all the areas and stuff.
Why a passion project for you?
Because it's, to me, it's an important story. I've heard so many stories. You know, my family was Jewish and heard so many Holocaust stories, but I didn't know. And I talked to so many people who don't know this story, that didn't know the role that it played, you know, in really saving the lives. There wasn't any one person who protected them, but just the city in general allowed a whole culture to continue and exist. And and I think it's a story really worth telling.
Can't wait to read it. It'll be out in the fall, and of course, Flesh and Blood is out in paperback now. If you want to pick it up, the new one is called The Far Side of the Sky, and it should be out sometime at the end of December or September.
Now, Daniel is forcing Fiona and I to wrestle for the galley copy. Yes, to who gets to read it first.
I didn't get that memo. Here. Totally don't want to wrestle you, dude.
Hey, give it back!
We're going to take a break, and when we return, yes, there's more smart people on the show, another doctor.